Talk, talk.
Hi.
Hello, Angry Moderate here. And Angry Moderate's feeling a little sad this morning after the Celtics lost to the Lakers. But the Angry Moderate will recover very quickly because I'm not a huge basketball fan, I must say. More of a baseball and soccer guy. And I mentioned last week that we have the World Cup soccer tournament. The World's game, not the United States' game, but the World's game. But the United States, this is being recorded on Friday, plays Slovenia this morning. The United States, a nation of some 310 million people, and Slovenia, a nation of some 2 million people. One would think that based upon those demographics, the United States should win 150 million to 0. But it will not happen. Should be a good game. I predict that the United States and Slovenia draw at 1, or the United States wins 2-1. The U.S. has a good team. Slovenia has a good team. And that is all I have to say about that. Let's get right to the question, shall we? Here we go. Got some good questions from my writing, and people have emailed me some good questions. We'll comment on the national and international economic markets and blither on about other, as we say, mishigas. This is Alex writing from Teaneck, New Jersey. Beautiful, bucolic Teaneck, New Jersey. Alex writes, Dan, talk more about extend and pretend. Hello. Well, Alex, extend and pretend is this idea that the federal government can use spending and this thing called quantitative easing, which is, of course, one of the myriad of euphemisms that the federal government uses when it is simply printing and or borrowing money. Extend and pretend is the idea that the federal government can create money and then use that money to offset all kinds of debts in the private sector as a way to create the illusion of there being economic health in our country. Now, extend and pretend goes farther, Alex, than just the creation of money. It's also the creation of policies and measurements and statistics that all create the illusion that are meant to fool you, Alex, and your sisters and brothers and folks around the nation into believing that things in the United States are on the mend in terms of the economy. I'll give you a couple of examples about this idea of extend and pretend. One example. You know, mortgages are hard to come by right now. People don't want to go into debt to necessarily purchase homes because there's a lot of fear that those debts are going to become somewhat of a burden for them. But the federal government believes that the only way that we can fix the economy is to get the consumer to spend. We've got to keep spending because that's what our economy is based upon. 70% of our $14+ trillion GDP, 70% of our economy is based upon consumption. But the consumer is tapped out. The consumer can't spend any more money, so what do? Well, you got to entice them to go further into debt. You have to entice them, bring them in, lure them in with bait so that they will spend money that they don't have. So what does the federal government do? The federal government says to people, hey, if you'll agree to go out and purchase a new home, we'll create an $8,000 tax credit just for you. And American consumers, not being the most savvy of human beings on the planet, are like, oh, this is fantastic. I can own a home and I'm getting an $8,000 tax credit from the federal government and my mortgage payments are really low and I'm building equity in my home and my retirement's good. You get the picture, Alex? So they get the $8,000 tax credit from the federal government. They purchase their home. They're still in debt. They've got a 30-year mortgage that they're paying extraordinary amounts of money and interest, but this of time, of course, to the federal government through the FHA. The federal government then can create these statistics where they say, look at this. Home starts are going through the roof. The recovery is here. It's happy days again. But it's not, because of two things. We are pretending to create this economic growth. We're creating the illusion that there's economic growth. The federal government is creating the illusion on purpose. This is what they do. This is a purposeful action. The angry moderate is feeling a little conspiratorial this morning. And that's why I say the federal government does it on purpose. Look, Alex, the federal government has a vested interest in people around the nation feeling good about things moving forward. Unfortunately, the government is finding that people are catching on to their baloney and are starting to say, wait a sec, you've been saying this for a while now, but I still don't have a job and I'm still in debt up to my eyeballs and I'm not able to get out of that debt. And the bonuses that are being procured by the bankers are still in the billions of dollars. And meanwhile, I go to the grocery store and I spend $30 on a bag of granola and a hunk of cheese. Well, the federal government, for example, I'm going to give you an example here. The other day, there was a report that came out from the federal government that retail sales were on the rebound. Actually, this was a federal report for the state of New Hampshire, that retail sales are rebounding. Now, how does the government measure retail sales? Well, they do it on this thing called a month-on-month basis. So they look at same-store sales month-on-month. So they compare the sales of stores that are part of their grouping of stores with regard to their study, how things are month on month. So if there are 3 stores that sell $100 worth of goods, stick with me here, Alex, and the next month those 3 stores sell $100 worth of goods, then retail sales have gone up 0. They've gone down 0, but they've gone up 0. Well, let's say, Alex, that one of those stores goes out of business, right? Folds up the tent, closes the doors, lays off the employees, done, finished. The federal government, in its infinite wisdom in trying to manipulate you and me into believing that retail sales are rebounding, doesn't report on the closure of that business in their month-on-month retail sales, same-store sales study. So the next month, the federal government says, wow, look at these tax receipts. These are fantastic. Retail sales have gone up 50%. Well, really what's happened is that one store has gone out of business, so everybody who would have shopped at the 3 stores now only can shop at the 2 stores to purchase the same amount of goods. In fact, if they said retail sales have gone up 10%, what we can glean from that with a bankruptcy and a closure of a store is actually retail sales have gone down. But the government doesn't want you to know that. The government wants you to think that things are rebounding because the government believes that it's all a confidence game. And as long as you can believe that things are going to be okay, you're going to go out and spend your money and go further into debt. You're going to go to the bank and take out a loan and purchase a new car because you think that economic recovery is right around the corner. That is extend and pretend. And it's done at every level of the government-corporate relationship. Whether it's allowing banks, the mega banks, to mark their assets, not to the marketplace, not to how much they would actually be sold in the marketplace, but just to fantasy. They can say, oh yeah, this bundle of securities is worth this much. And then they can put that on their balance sheet and say, hey, look, we're really a healthy bank. We're in great shape. We're very solvent, aren't we? And then the people say, hey, look at that. The banks are recovering. They're very solvent. We're going to go further into debt and spend our money. And then Barack Obama or whomever's a president, it doesn't matter if it's Barack Obama or George Bush or Bill Clinton, or gets to go on the TV and say, good evening, my fellow Americans. I have good news to report. The economy is recovering. We are seeing growth in all sectors of the economy. We're just around the corner from another boom time. We're going to have 10% GDP growth. Well, it's a sham. It's the skin on the teeth of reality. It's an illusion. That is extend and pretend, Alex. Back to camera number 1. Let's see what we've got here. Here's a good one. Jim from Claremont, New Hampshire. Jim writes, Dan, heard you talk on the radio the other day about the outlaws. More, please. Well, first I'll have some coffee from my exceptionally large coffee mug. Houston, see? Houston, we have a problem. No, we don't. That's great coffee. The Outlaws. So I heard the story on NPR the other day. Oh, camera two. The Outlaws is a motorcycle gang, right? They're sort of the rival of the Hells Angels. And there was a federal sweep of all of these headquarters of the Outlaws, because the Outlaws motorcycle gang is involved in all kinds of criminal enterprises. The sale of drugs or running numbers or, I don't know, you go through the list, and the Outlaws motorcycle gang is involved in these criminal endeavors. And so the federal government is putting all of its energies into reining in this terrible outlaw group of outlaws. So I was kind of thinking that this was sort of funny, because the real outlaws are the folks in the financial industry and their compatriots on Capitol Hill. Now let me go with this here. Jim from Claremont. The folks in the financial industry over the last 30 years have had no real regulation to tie their hands with regard to being able to make as much money as they want to be able to create Ponzi scheme after Ponzi scheme to get buy-in from the American people, and to not only Americans, people around the world, and to fleece those people of their hard-earned dollars and to make billions in profits for themselves. You see, these are the outlaws. The fact that there's a motorcycle gang out there that's selling drugs, which I'm certainly not saying is a good thing, or that's running numbers, or that's engaging in other criminal enterprises, is that worthy of investigation? Sure. However, why is it that the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, the supposedly most important regulatory agency on the face of the planet, is doing nothing? Nothing. As a matter of fact, they're doing less than nothing. There's so much regulatory capture in the United States so as to make this look like the Star Trek episode, A Piece of the Action. Do you know that episode, Jim? It's a great episode with Kirk and Spock and all those guys, where they go down to a planet, and this planet, as their Bible, as the central constitution for their planet, is a book called Chicago Gangs of the 1920s. They run their entire society based upon this book that describes how gangs have worked in Chicago. Well, that's what we've got. We've got criminal enterprises all throughout Wall Street in terms of the way securities were packaged and the way that ratings agencies lied about the value of these securities and these mortgage-backed securities, and the government and the Securities and Exchange Commission being bought off to not in any way regulate the kinds of activities that are going on with regard to these financial Ponzi schemes, which Ponzi scheme by definition should be illegal, have been swept under the rug, one after the other swept under the rug. As a matter of fact, the Ponzi economy continues. Quantitative easing, which I mentioned earlier in my response to Alex from TNEC's message, quantitative easing is a huge Ponzi scheme. The government creates money, it throws money into the economy to create the illusion of economic health, and then people take their hard-earned dollars or go further into debt because they're under the illusion that the economy is growing and is healthy. Those dollars disappear. Those dollars are gobbled up by the criminal outlaw activities of Wall Street and the financial industry. Those are the outlaws, Jim. Those are Adam Smith, Jim, who wrote The Wealth of Nations back in the late 18th century, talked about this idea of the invisible hand of free markets, that if left to their own way, free markets will operate in a way that will create, I'm oversimplifying here, will create profits for those involved in the free market. And of course, the folks who are at the head of the financial industries, and that the folks who at the Tuck School at Dartmouth and at the Wharton School at Penn, they talk about this idea of free market economies and Adam Smith's invisible hand, and they cherry pick the information as put forward by Adam Smith. But you know what they don't talk about? They don't talk about the fact that Adam Smith, in the same breath he was talking about the invisible hand, also criticized the capital markets back there in the late 18th century and corporate interests from colluding on keeping the rates, the employment, the salaries for employees down, or colluding on how to extract every last possible cent in what amounts to buy-in from those parts, those fringes of society that aren't part of the center. That's what we have here. We have for the last almost 40 years, since 1971, but particularly beginning in the 1980s and all the way up into the 90s, and now, of course, all the way up into 2010 and beyond, we have a corporate structure, a financial structure in this nation that runs amok, that's anarchistic, that has no regulation upon it. And Congress benefits from it because we have a representative system in our country in which the people who get elected to Congress are the ones who have the most money. The people who become governors of states are the ones who have the largest election war chests. It's not democracy, Jim. It's corporate democracy. It's folks who have the ability to purchase political power through their wealth. Now, as I said, the angry moderate, being me speaking of himself in the third person, is feeling rather conspiratorial today. And I call the show The Angry Moderate because I don't think this is a left-wing issue or a right-wing issue. I don't think this has to do with communism or socialism out on the left, or fascism or statism in a corporate fascist sense out on the right. I don't think this is about Mao or Stalin or Lenin or about Mussolini or Hitler. I think this is simply about money. This is just about money. And it's about how the government and our governmental structure and our supposedly representative democracy benefits from the money, the billions upon billions of dollars that are created by fraud in this country to perpetuate their position in society. So you asked me, Jim, about the outlaws, and my point is that the real outlaws here are the dudes on Wall Street and on Constitution Avenue, Federal Reserve, who are figuring out ways to perpetuate the Ponzi scheme, to perpetuate our pyramid scheme economy so that the rest of us in the middle class are going to continue to suffer, and the people who have no skin in the game but have tens of billions of dollars of personal wealth are going to feel no pain whatsoever. None. All right, let's see what we've got here. Michael from San Luis Obispo, California. San Luis Obispo. You know, I spent a lovely afternoon in San Luis Obispo. No, I didn't. I think I'd have never, well, maybe I think I drove through there. Isn't that on I-5, San Luis Obispo? Michael writes, Dan, love to hear what you think about economics in general. Science or sham? Camera 2. Michael, I found a quote online as I was thinking about your question that, quote, economics is just an exercise in psychological manipulation. And I thought that was a very apt quotation with regard to economics. As a matter of fact, Michael, that kind of reflects my sentiments about the science of economics. Now, mathematics is a science, is a very holistic and beyond refutation, irrefutable, if you will, science. Economics, on the other hand, has transcended science. It's no longer about science. Economics is simply a way, a series of decisions using mathematics as the justification for manipulating the sentiments and psychology of people in the society to give them a sense of confidence or a belief in an economic system or in a form of currency or whatever to create what we call economic growth. Look, if Americans came to the belief that they no longer needed dollars in order to service their tax bills, there would be no more fiat currency in the world. Our experiment with irredeemable currency that you can't say, hey, I'd like $50 in gold, please. Remember these? Remember gold certificates? Remember, Michael? Who was that from San Luis Obispo? Yeah, Michael. When you were young, I don't know if you're old like me, that you get maybe a silver certificate, $5 bill silver certificate, which gave you the right to cash in your $5 for $5 worth of silver. You know how that went away with regard to gold in 1971, August 15th, 1971, when Richard Nixon basically defaulted on our gold obligations with foreign countries and said the dollar is now totally decoupled from gold. There's no redemptive quality. The only thing you can redeem for $1 is another dollar. Well, those dollars, I mean, people say this all the time. They're not, they're just pieces of paper, or they're just electronic entries into computers. The only thing that gives them any value is people's belief that these dollars can purchase goods, or in particular, that these dollars are necessary in order to service your tax bills. If Americans came to the belief that there was no longer any need for them to accumulate dollars in order to then pay their taxes, fiat currency, because the dollar is the preeminent fiat currency in the world, fiat currency would become worthless. And we would watch, essentially, an entire paradigm shift with regard to what we're going to do in global economics. So the government has, again, this extraordinarily vested interest in keeping people believing that the dollar has value, that it has worth, and that the dollar is going to precipitate, or the way the dollar is used and employed is going to precipitate economic growth, which is going to increase the wealth of these individuals. And so economics is really nothing more than a series of manipulations of the psychology, the mass psychology, the herd, if you will, of the population, and the individual psychology of trying to get people to believe that things are okay, that the dollars or the fiat currencies that we use have value, and that we can spend those dollars and get goods in exchange. So, Michael, I think that that's a really good quote. Just an exercise in psychological manipulation. That's all economics has become. And what we're going to find is a very distinct conflict that is now coming into the fore with regard to mathematics and economics, because the mathematics tell us that private sector debt, and public sector debt, but private debt in particular, just in the United States alone, $2.5 trillion out of a GDP of $14.5 trillion. What is that, 18% of GDP is reflected in just in debt alone? If the government wasn't pumping literally trillions of dollars into the economy through quantitative easing, what would we be seeing? We would be seeing an acceleration of deleveraging, of people trying to get out of debt, which would create extraordinary deflation, which would precipitate a jump in unemployment. And the government is like, we can't let that happen, because then people will think, oh my gosh, this really is a depression. We need to get our money out of the banks. There would be runs on banks. So what does the government do? The government, under the guise of good economic monetary policy, with Ben Bernanke getting up in front of Congress and Alan Greenspan before him, spewing a bunch of completely unintelligible rhetoric, gets up there and essentially says, if you just distill it down to its very basics, we are going to do everything in our power to make you believe that your dollars have value. We are going to do this is our monetary policy. We're going to do everything in our power to make you believe that dollars have value. That's all they're doing. They're creating trillions of dollars through these programs of quantitative easing and bailouts and stimulus, etc., as a way to keep people from seeing what's really happening with regard to this accelerating deleveraging of private debt. Now, I just want to say one thing, Michael. A lot of people out there are economists who say, that's fine. You know, what we're going to do, and this is okay, is we're going to print and create a lot of money. We're going to borrow a lot of money. We're going to restart the economy, and that's going to get growth going again, and then we'll be able to deleverage or go out of debt in a more controlled way. But the bond market is not going to let that happen. The bond market vigilantes, as they're called, they're not going to let that happen. They're going to call the bluff eventually of this United States effort at quantitative easing. It might take years, Michael. And interest rates are going to go bing through the ceiling, and then we're going to watch as that fiat currency crisis takes place anyway. Hope I answered your question for you, Michael. Back to camera number one. So what do we have here? This is Terry from Bath. Now, Terry, I'm not sure if this is Bath, Maine, or another Bath. Terry just wrote, I'm Terry from Bath. Hi, Terry. Dan, Terry writes, is there any way to stop the Fed's efforts at creating cheap money for the purpose of blowing bubbles? That is a very good question, Terry. Here I am. It's kind of like, all right. Terry, I found a quote. This is from Richard Fisher. He's the Federal Reserve, the head of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. Now, this is a quote from 2008, May of 2008. This is prior to the meltdown. Remember, the meltdown was in September and October of 2008. Okay, so this is a big high honcho in the Federal Reserve. This is one of the top 10, right? I mean, this is a big guy. If Casey Kasem here, and in the top 10, you get the picture? Richard Fisher said this, quote, even the perception that the Fed is pursuing a cheap money strategy is a risk to the long-term welfare of the U.S. economy. The Fed will never let this happen, ever, period. End quote. That's a knee slapper, isn't it? I'm going to slap my knee. That's a knee slapper because that's exactly what the Federal Reserve has done. The Federal Reserve, by lowering interest rates to zero, effective zero, and by essentially flooding the marketplace with interest-free money, with bailouts where these bailoutees don't even have to repay the money. Right? Did you read recently that a bunch of banks that receive TARP monies aren't going to be able to repay them because they're not solvent? So what's the federal government going to do? Well, we're just going to keep pumping money in there until we restart growth. Even the perception that the Federal Reserve is pursuing a cheap money strategy is a risk to the long-term welfare of the U.S. economy, and the Fed will never let that happen ever, period. Wrong, liar. And that should tell you everything right there. The Federal Reserve is pursuing a cheap money policy because they believe that blowing bubbles is the only way to reflate or reinflate the economy. The Federal Reserve is pursuing a policy of cheap money, access to free money for the big players, for the banks, because the Federal Reserve and our monetary policymakers believe in the idea that monetary velocity will save us all. We'll pump trillions into the system, and that money will circulate all around, and it will create more money, and there'll be growth, and everybody will be buying new houses and competing. Easy money. And yet this guy, who's a big honcho in the Federal Reserve, said, oh, no, it'll never happen because that would be a risk to the long-term welfare of the U.S. economy. That should tell you everything. That should tell you everything, Terry. That the Federal Reserve is pursuing an easy money strategy to blow these economic bubbles. And basically what that means is the long-term welfare of the economy be darned. That the long-term welfare of the U.S. economy is in extremis. That's what we're worried about. That's what the angry moderate is worried about. Do I think that we're going to experience economic collapse right now, 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now? No, I don't, because I think that the Federal Reserve and the Treasury and the Congress have a lot of power still at their disposal. As the old expression goes, they still have a lot of bullets in their economic gun, right? Of course, they can't drop interest rates unless they drop them to negative, right? I mean, interest rates are already at zero, but they can keep creating money. They can keep monetizing debt. In other words, essentially, the Federal Reserve creating money to buy the bonds that are being offered by the Treasury, in essence. They have a lot of weapons in their economic arsenal to keep this extend and pretend going, to keep kicking the can down the road. But what's actually happening is that the long term, as Richard Fisher, a big high honcho at the Federal Reserve, said himself, the long-term welfare of the U.S. economy is at risk. The Fed will never do this. No, they'll never do this, never. Yeah, they did, and they keep doing it. Now, there was a question here with regard to bubbles, and I do want to comment on what this, explain housing, what is a bubble? Because some people hear this word bubble and they don't quite